This one has to do with a group of vegetables, okay? And most of what I have is broccoli, cauliflower, and some other brassicas, and then I've got little bits and pieces on some of the others to show you that may be useful, okay? So when we think of broccoli quality and when we do a variety of evaluations, okay, you know, this is the type of thing that we would evaluate, okay? And you can see on the composition, we can look for the glucosinolates because within that there are compounds that provide the anti-cancer sulforaphane, for example, comes from this particular glucosinolate, okay? So, you know, we can do more of that kind of analysis, but often we don't. Okay, so maturity. Can you see differences there? You see how the heads are tighter. Now, the implication here is that's going to really affect the post-harvest life. We have some problems in the field, this one called cat eye. You can have hollow heart and things like that, okay? And nitrogen fertilization. I worked with a farm advisor many years ago, and we did a lot of trials on fertilization of broccoli. And you can see, you know, we get little heads with low fertilization, total pounds of N per acre. And you can see that, yeah, we fertilize because we get bigger heads, right? But we did find some implication on shelf life. But you had to really be over-fertilizing to reduce the shelf life. Anything from 150 to the 240, which was the common for industry, shelf life wasn't impacted. So that was, for me, a bummer. But anyway, it was good to know that, right? Okay, all right. So here's a little bit on composition, sugar, ascorbic acid in different components. And you know, one of the products in recent years are broccoli coins or broccoli slaw and things. And it turns out the stems, I always like the stems more than the head, actually. And the stems have a fair amount of ascorbic acid. So there's a little bit of data there. Oh, the crumbles are coming from the stalk? Good. Yep. Yeah. Yeah, well, it's good stuff, in other words, okay? It's not just fiber, right? Here's some data on respiration rates, and you can look at that if you'd like. Intact, spears, florets, and here we have some data on the broccoli coins, so at different temperatures, if you're interested in that, okay? Now, this relates to, like with the leafy greens, if it looks fresh, it also has good nutritional value. And so here we're looking at 3 temperatures. We're at 32, 50, 68, a big spread. We're looking at carotenoids, the chlorophyll, ascorbic acid, and the sugars. And you can see the patterns are not exactly the same, but they're very similar. And that's where we have the idea. The freshness in our vegetables, the leafy greens, and this type of product in particular, it looks fresh. It's going to have good nutritional content, okay? Yep. All right. I showed this one already before. And just to point out that about the cutting color, you see those reactions, they're related to temperature, but not so tightly. That's why we need the modified atmospheres and why we use that in the broccoli. I also showed this. I apologize for the repetition, but at least we can go fast. But I put that up again because you may be interested in some of the different cultivars and about the different rates of discoloration, okay? So for example, here, if we look at day 8, there were clearly some, and here's our line. So we said, wow, what's critical is once they reach that 2, that's slight. But you can see right there, there's a group that were still just barely a 2 and some that already were at a 3, which would be the limit of marketability. That's with no atmosphere. So when we evaluate the varieties, we look at no atmosphere. Why? Because we say, well, even though you would have an atmosphere, you could have product package, and you could have a leaker, or the atmospheres are not exactly the same. So we try to evaluate them in what we call worst case scenario. I know sometimes in the industry they want to use, well, here's our packaging, we'll evaluate the variety in the packaging. But to me, you don't want to use the atmosphere because then you see, okay, which ones really don't brown as quickly. Now you add an atmosphere, and that will help to protect the product. Is that clear? So we always use what we call worst case scenario, okay? No atmosphere, okay? All right. Now, this is a little different. You haven't seen this before, so let me put this. Okay, so we were working with a company, and they were doing vegetable trays, and we had different vegetables, 5, I think, okay? And so you can see that here we have 18 days, so we need a shelf life of 18 days, and we use 41 because that's what they wanted us to use. I argued for lower temperature, I'll have you know, but they wanted me to use 41, okay? So we are looking at different atmospheres. Here we have air. And in air, you can see we have some yellowing after 18 days. We have certainly some browning, some decay. And if we have an atmosphere of 3% oxygen, 7% CO2, a little bit better, but not good enough. So in other words, that atmosphere isn't modified enough to really provide protection. And so these atmospheres in the green circle, all of those atmospheres work pretty well, and we had good quality product, okay? And I'm going to come back to sugar snap peas from the same experiment and show you how sugar snap peas, the broccoli is happy, but the sugar snap peas are not very happy. And so what can we do? All right. So, all right. Now another problem with the broccoli would be, wow, the bane of our existence are what the little crumbles, right? The little pieces. you have a bag of broccoli florets and cauliflower florets, and you got all those little pieces sticking to the bag with the moisture. It just looks like, do I want to buy that? You know, it just doesn't look good, right? And so here, what we learned, they're a small amount, right? So this is percent, right? Okay. So they're a very small amount, but they're visible. And you can see from one processor, we had 3 processors that we were working with, and one always had more problem with the crumbles. So they were doing more damage. It was related with a variety. We don't know exactly the reason, but they always had more crumbles, okay? And so obviously we're looking to really minimize that, okay? All right. So some other problems. So here we have, you know, of course, temperature. Here we have temperature in an atmosphere. One of the things about the atmospheres is when you get to below about 3% oxygen, you start to get these sulfur volatiles that are not very pleasant. And so you want, although in the literature, there's some literature that shows you can go lower. That would be under very controlled conditions. But in practice, you don't want to have less oxygen than about 3%, or you're going to develop those sulfur volatiles that are really not pleasant, okay? So, you know, some other problems here. Anyway, for fresh cut, those are sort of the things we want, right? Okay? Our wish list. Now, one of the things is we know that the atmospheres are good for broccoli, and so one of the questions is we have other brassicas that people are working with. And so we were working with Italian researchers, actually, and they have like broccoli rabe or rapini. Anyone work with that? Yeah, we have yeah, all right. And then we have the Chinese broccoli or gailan, yeah? Very nice product, very delicious actually. And then we have the choy sum. So we did some work with different brassicas, and there are a couple more that we never worked with, and one was Brussels sprouts, which are very important now, and the other would be the broccolini, which was a new cultivar developed by one of our big companies, right? Okay. But the idea here is that I always said, well, you know, brassicas, okay, they're all going to be similar. And they basically are, but there are some slight differences among them. And so we do have a small paper, and there's a couple of graphs, of course, okay, you know. So, all right, here we go. And so we're looking at here visual quality, and we have the 4 vegetables. And here we did a bunch of atmospheres. So the idea there was the Italian researchers proposed that the CO2 was really damaging. It may be okay for broccoli, but it's not good for my rapini, right? Okay, so what we did was we did the experiment to see if that was the case. And it turned out that here we look at ammonia. So here, let's look at the broccoli rabe. And you can see that and the choy sum, yes, did not respond as well to the high CO2 containing atmospheres. So the Italian researcher was not just putting me on, she really had, you know, she was spot on there, okay? So we use the ammonia as a stress indicator. When I say freshness indicator, but also as an indicator of stressful atmospheres and stressful post-harvest conditions. Okay, any questions about those brassicas? Yeah? Yes? You know, I'd have to go back, but I'm pretty sure it was they worked in pounds per acre, which would be similar, right? Right. Okay, so pounds per acre, because that's what we work in, Fahrenheit and pounds per acre, right? Okay, so, you know. All right, so on the cauliflower, one of the things, and this would be a truism across the fresh cut, if we take like a head of cauliflower, here we're measuring respiration rates at different temperatures, and we just cut the florets, we're doing really minimal damage. So what do we expect? We expect the impact on respiration to be low. And you can see slight differences, but basically we're not, if we chop it up into small pieces, of course we're going to get high respiration. But that's a truth. The larger the piece size we can cut, the less different that product will be from the intact product, okay? Yeah. And this is a good example, okay? Now, one of the things that happens with the cauliflower, though, is what? Well, we beat the heck out of it, right? Okay, so, you know, I've seen people harvest in the field. So the harvester is picking up the cauliflower, trim it very carefully, and then he throws it on the table to pack it. It's like, okay, you know, so, you know, it's just, to me, common sense, right? And we know that all those little cells right on the surface are turgid, right? And so we just damage them, and what happens? Then the bacteria grow, fungi grow, we get discoloration, okay, that type of thing. So it's all about the careful handling, okay? That is the key to the cauliflower. Cauliflower is not as perishable as broccoli, right? We can store it for weeks, yeah? But it's perishable because we damage it. And here we're looking at 3 temperatures, and of course lower temperature won't prevent the browning, but it looks better than if you have it at warmer temperatures, right? So it's a combination. The injury that we do, warmer temperatures, and the bacteria and or fungi. Some cases it's fungi, but usually bacteria that grow. Now, one of the things about cauliflower that's interesting, anybody doing broccoli cauliflower mixes? Yeah? Okay. So broccoli likes CO2. But cauliflower, we have to be careful. So can you see a difference in the appearance of the cauliflower here? Can you see a difference in the appearance? Which one looks different? The one in the middle looks different. Yeah, the gray on the end. Okay, so the one on the left has 1% oxygen, and see, without the CO2, you're not going to prevent some of the browning. So just dropping the oxygen lowers respiration rate, but it's not going to control browning. The one in the middle, we have 7.5% CO2. The one on the right, we have 15% CO2. Broccoli will tolerate that. In the previous slide, I think they had up to 18% CO2. Broccoli will tolerate, but this cauliflower won't. So it turns gray, and then if you cooked it, it smells horrible, okay? So we have to be very careful that in the packages we don't have too high of a CO2 or we have higher amount of oxygen. So again, it's the combination of that low oxygen with the 15%. If we raise the oxygen to 5 or 6%, which can happen in the case of broccoli also, then we might be okay, all right? But just sort of, yes?
That's really critical because most broccoli and cauliflower packaging, go back to that last slide.
Oh, yep.
Most of them use microperforation.
All right.
If you've got 2% oxygen, you're going to have 18%
Right,
dioxide.
right.
So you have to play with that
Yeah.
level of
Yeah.
oxygen you want so you don't have
Right.
too much
But probably for the broccoli in that case, you wouldn't want to go below 4 or 5% anyway. The CO2 is what's helping the broccoli more than the oxygen in that case, contrary to lettuce, okay? And so then you would be okay. Yeah, okay. But, you know, we can see that as a problem, okay? So, okay. And then here's some data on some graphs, okay, about the same thing. And you can look at the volatiles, the fermentative volatiles and all that, okay, off odors and stuff, okay? So it's a high CO2. So then the rest of it, I have just a few things about a few vegetables in the last 5 minutes here. One is about the celery. So here, they've been cut with a knife and things. They look pretty similar, don't they, okay? Yeah, but I'll show you once they're stored. So here when they're stored, here was knife, commercial blade cut, and here's with water jet. And here's where we get that whitening of the surface, right? So that water jet is, you know, and so you can say, to me, that doesn't look as any more attractive than the other. But on the other, you have the vascular tissue here is beginning to deteriorate. So from a microbiological standpoint, the celery is better with the white, the water jet than it is like that. And here's what they look like on the ends, okay? So, you know, it's, yeah, I mean, the water jet's better, but you do have that phenomenon. Now, I know that in our group this year, we have people who work with mushrooms, and honestly, I've never done that much work with mushrooms. I just have a couple slides I would like to show you, okay? So one is mushrooms we always consider to be so perishable, right, that when you cut them, it doesn't matter because they're already so high respiring, and that's what this data shows basically. So here we have respiration rates, and the red is the sliced and the green is intact. So you see the difference. Intact at 3 temperatures, we're at 32, 41, and 50. And of course, the mushrooms, what temperature do we want to be near? 32, right? Keep them as cold as possible and dry. That's where we have the concept of cold and dry, because if we have humidity and too much moisture, what do we get? Bacteria growth on top of our fungus, right? So we don't want that. Cold and dry. And you can see here how, yes, the slicing increases it slightly, but the whole thing has to do with the temperature in order to minimize respiration. And you can see similar results here with the whiteness and the firmness. And of course, the slicing, you can see you have a little bit faster loss in firmness, but again, not that great a difference because they're already so perishable, right? Okay, so now atmospheres do work. And of course, because we have people who are expert in mushrooms, correct me if I state this incorrectly, but in the United States, we're not allowed to use packaging that does not have a hole in it. And that is because of the risk of Clostridium botulinum, which would grow in without oxygen, right? Okay, so all the packaging has to have holes. So Jeff, go ahead.
Historically, that's correct. FDA put out a letter, basically said it was an advice letter. And when FDA gives you advice, it's de facto law.
Yeah.
That said it had to have a visual hole. With the advances of microperforation, and I can actually send anybody who wants to see the language from FDA.
Okay.
They're coming back and saying, you know what? With microperforations, it's possible that you may not need a visible hole, but you have to generate the data that demonstrates to us that it will not go anaerobic.
Very good.
If you're going to use microperforated, make sure you've got either independent or somehow data, so when FDA is knocking on your door, you can say, yes, there's no visual hole, but here's the data that shows our microperforations will prevent it from ever going anaerobic. anaerobic, so you mitigate the risk of cluster.
Very good. I sort of assumed something was like that. That's why I kind of phrased it that way.
Within
And
the
so,
last 9 to
yeah.
12 months.
Okay. Oh, wow,
Got
that recent. Okay,
documentation if
wow.
anybody wants.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Jeff. Yeah. Because, and the reason before we would lament that, it was because certainly the atmospheres can be quite beneficial to retard the deterioration. Here's an example. Now, we're at 2.5, 36 Fahrenheit. And if I redid this experiment, I would include what other temperature? Yeah, exactly. Okay. But you can see then, if we're at 45, 41, and 36, at 41, you can see certainly there the effect of high CO2, and we have 1% oxygen, high CO2, right? Okay. So the CO2 really helps to retain the whiteness. It's better, even at 36, you can see that those appear better. So there is quite a bit of literature showing that controlled atmospheres or modified atmospheres are beneficial on the mushrooms. But then again, that went back to what the issue is with us in the packaging, and thank you for clarifying that. Now, one other reference I came across that if you're in the mushrooms you might be interested is people have been working with high oxygen atmospheres, and some have said, and here's some data, I still have trouble wrapping my mind around this, but I'm just getting old, that's what it is they use very high oxygen, and that also affects, the interesting thing about this paper is they actually measured the activity of polyphenol oxidase, and they looked at the genes and the induction of some of those enzymes. So it's actually a very, scientifically well done paper, okay? I haven't read it well enough, okay? But if you're interested, okay? So here they have this one treatment that was better. They gave it 3 days of 100% oxygen. Then they transferred it to this treatment, which was 80% oxygen and 20% CO2. And that is really a controlled atmosphere that is very different than what we use, okay? But I just put that out there because you can see after 20 days, the photo shows that, yes, the visual quality was really quite different, right? So anyway, there's a lot of research on the mushrooms modifying atmospheres. That's what I want to say there. Okay, then we have beans, another category. And so, they top and tail them. And this is sort of how I feel about lettuce when lettuce first came out. I'm going to be so lazy not to cut my own salad. So when I see the beans, I sort of feel the same way. But just a few days ago, I was there topping and tailing beans. I thought, wow, the next time I'm going to go to, up to the store and buy a package of pre-prepared beans there, okay? Because this is work, okay. So anyway, so here they may darken and storage and, you get decay and things. But one of the things I want to draw your attention to has to do with chilling injury on the beans. So this is one symptom. You can see brown spots, but you can also get brown spots by other ways. Condensation of moisture and various things, but you can get that kind of chilling. But here's what I want to show you, okay? And here, so these are more close-ups. So this at 41, we tend to see the spots, okay? At 32, we tend to see a darkening of the bean. And so I've had people call me and say, okay, I've got these green beans and they're turning dark. What should I do? Cook them and eat them fast. That was my recommendation. But seriously, the idea would be like the grape tomatoes. Don't take them out of the cold. You take them out of the cold and they're going to fall apart, right? Okay, because they've been chilled. But as long as you keep them cold, you won't develop the symptoms of decay, etc., okay? So that's what we're doing with the green beans. They're not so happy at that low temperature like the grape tomatoes, but they will tolerate for periods of time. But sometimes you'll see that they're very dark. Now, there are varieties themselves on the hair carp that are really quite dark, right? So, we don't really see the darkness because of the selection of the varieties, okay? But we have to recognize they are chilling sensitive, okay? But once we top and tail them, then it's a matter of, moving them quickly. Now, the last thing I think I have time for maybe are the sugar snap.
5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay. The sugar snap peas, because that's a very popular item on the vegetable trays. And when we worked on the vegetable trays, we had celery, broccoli, carrots, grape tomatoes, and sugar snap peas. And it was a surprise to me that the peas often were a problem, okay? So we know from the literature done years back that we want to keep the peas near zero, really keep them cold, as cold as possible, near zero. They don't freeze until like -2 Celsius or something, no? And that really modified atmospheres are not that good for them. So right there, just reading the literature is like, okay, maybe on that tray with 15% CO2 inside, it's not so good for the peas, right, okay? But then there's another thing, and that's how we source the peas. Most of them are coming offshore, and there are some people in the industry that think, okay, we give asparagus high CO2 in our shipments. Wow, that should be good for the sugar snap peas. Yeah, they're green, that type of thing. But it turns out asparagus shipments respond well to high CO2, whereas the sugar snap peas don't. So there was some of that going on where then the fresh cut processors were getting these peas in, and the question is, how were they handled beforehand, right? Okay. So we actually worked with one of the suppliers, bringing them in from Peru and offshore, in terms of how they were handled, and we set up some experiments to show that yes, the high CO2 atmospheres are damaging. So as fresh cut processors, the bottom line is, okay, you want to get the peas without an atmosphere, that they've just been kept cold. Now you put them on your trays, they will tolerate some atmospheres, and I'll show you some visuals, okay? So that's the idea, knowing how they were handled before you got them so that they will tolerate your conditions, okay? All right? So let's see a couple examples. Okay, so remember on the broccoli, I showed you the same atmospheres, okay? Whoops, sorry. Okay, I showed you the same atmospheres. So for the broccoli, these were the best atmospheres. Can you see how the sugar snap peas looked? Pretty ugly there, B and C. But notice D. If we raise the oxygen, you see that the CO2, same level of CO2 as here, was not as damaging. So it's not just the CO2, it is also the oxygen level that becomes important. So we would say at least have 10% oxygen in that container and try not to go above the 12%. And that atmosphere also worked for the broccoli, right? Okay. So we can make them match, but here the whole idea comes into what is the compatibility of those products. We worry about temperature like the tomatoes, okay? But really probably a bigger issue is the atmospheres and whether the products are compatible in a given atmosphere that you have inside there, right? Okay? All right. All right, a bigger experiment, you know, you have more conditions, you know, we did several, we published a paper, you can read that if you like. And then the last thing, something we worked on, had to do with green onions. And of course, these are respiration rates of the chopped onions, very high, okay? But the idea of having truly, you know, clean onions. Anybody work with green onions? Yeah? Yes? No? Yeah? All right. So here's what we have in the market. It's the middle, right? You still have root material there, right? So the idea is you want a clean cut. But you have a little stem. So onions sitting on a little stem. And you have about plus or minus a millimeter. So you want to line them up and cut them precisely. Well, we don't have equipment that is cost effective. We could do it, but it'd be too costly, right? So the idea there is, are there treatments to prevent, once you cut them and you cut the stem off, then you get what you call extension growth, right, okay? And they turn brown and they extend like that, okay? So it's a bit of a problem. So it turns out you can give them what we call heat shock treatments. Here's another photo, okay? We still have roots. Here we did a perfect job of cutting, okay? Here we did also pretty good. We still have some stem, so they don't show that extension growth. And then here, whoop, we removed all the stem, and you get a physical, and then you get actually a growth of the tissue, okay, without the stem. All right, so you can give them heat treatments, which of course the industry is very happy to know about, right, okay? But we showed that it does work, okay? But the whole solution here is being able to cut the onions in a precision way. And as far as I know, the last time I talked with someone in the industry about this is there is equipment that we could do that. We can do those kind of precision things. It's just that it's not cost effective enough yet for the industry, right? Okay, so, okay. And that's my last slide, okay? So any quick questions?